Now, if we go to the second diagram, I want to show you something about a logical fallacy that's involved, and most people buy into this. And until you get into some of the philosophers of science, this isn't even discussed. Besides the problem of applying a methodology intended for study of repeatable phenomena to non-repeatable phenomena, violations of basic logical laws are often overlooked in analysis of empirical data. This is another feature of scientific investigation casually treated at all in modern education. In logic, if we observe a statement of inference that if P is true, then Q is true, this law occurs in all theory testing when P is a theory, Q it would be an empirically observable state of affairs. So here we have several theories from T1, T2, T3, so forth. And the arrows show that, for example, that data set, the observed data set in the red rectangle, there are two theories that would imply that set of data, T2 and T7. Now, how do you distinguish T2 from T7 then? What empirical test can you devise if both the theories are implying the same data set? And the answer is you can't. There's no empirical way whatsoever to distinguish between theory 2 and theory 7. So in effect, what happens, now we get philosophical. The problem is nobody's trained to think through what's going on at this point. You have to have theory selection criteria, but theory selection criteria have nothing to do with the empirical data. I pick a theory philosophically because T7 is theistically friendly, or theory 2 is materialistically friendly. So my point in showing you this chart is that where you have multiple theories implying the same thing, you must necessarily get involved in religious and philosophical decision making, because that's the only way you can discern the theories from each other. Now if we can go back to the text. We have a long quote. This is a famous one from Richard Lewontin, who is a famous population biologist at Harvard University. And it's a great long quote. It's on page 5 of your text. You have it. This quote was a review that he did of Carl Sagan's book, his last book, and he wrote in the New York Review of Books. And it's a great quote, because now we're talking about letting the cat out of the bag. What's going on? Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for just-so stories. It is not the methods and institutions of science that compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation, a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So once the theory selection becomes a metaphysical issue, now we have Romans 1:18 coming into play. What does Romans 1:18 tell us about the human heart? It's afflicted with a theophobia. And theophobia, the fear of God, in the bad sense of the word, the fear of God, to avoid him, causes suppression. So if we compare modern cosmology with ancient pagan cosmology, such as appears in the Numa Elish, we have found interesting parallels. They both extrapolate natural processes to perform magical feats like spontaneous generation of life. Both depict a very old universe, and both submerge man under nature. These considerations are no mere intellectual pastimes. There's 3 obvious examples come to mind of the impact of cosmology on hermeneutics. 1, how origin of the extraterrestrial universe impacts the interpretation of Genesis 1, especially the 4th day puzzle, as well as all later biblical references to creation from Exodus to Revelation. 2, how the geological history of the earth impacts interpretation of the flood of Genesis 6 to 8 and all later biblical references to that event. And 3, how the chronology of the 2nd millennium BC impacts interpretation of the Exodus and conquest phenomena around which cosmic language is used of the end-time prophecies. So, where do we go? Section summary. The hermeneutic for interpreting cosmic catastrophe texts that starts with a denial of the biblical story necessarily must end in a denial of the biblical story. So, in summarizing this first section, we're saying that there's a cosmological influence that comes to bear on the hermeneutic. And I've referenced 1 Corinthians 15 because when you contest this against the reports of the resurrection, which, by the way, also must be dismissed on the basis of cosmology, if you're going to go that route, what does Paul say? He says, we have lied. We have a violation of the ethical ninth commandment, which is perjury. So if an Old Testament writer or a New Testament writer is reporting a historical event and it didn't really happen, we've got an ethical problem, not just a philosophic problem. You've got a perjury problem. So now let's go to the second major area, and that is the issue of how liberalism attempted to salvage theology from figurative language. If liberal higher criticism sawed off the biblical branch that could have provided cosmological support to orthodox theology, what other support could be found? Can a teleological vision and ethical tenets of the Bible be saved from the damage figurative interpretation does to historical testimony? Fortunately for liberalism, Immanuel Kant came on the scene, and ever since his day, liberal theology has supported itself by using various derivatives of his epistemology. So let's examine how liberalism attempted to save the idea of a judging and saving God without affirming his catastrophic intervention into our physical environment. We could go into a big detail here, which we don't have time, but Immanuel Kant, very complicated how he worked with this, but in the bottom line is that he divided knowledge into two parts. A phenomenal realm, in which where we experience through sensation, that's the part we know, but we can't know about the world as it really is, whether, for example, causality actually exists out there. What we know is only the organization that our minds put on the data. The real origin of truth now, for knowing what we perceive, is our mind, not the external world of nature and not the God of revealed truth. So much for our experiences of history. What about ethics and religion? They're all part of Kant's second realm, the noumenal. That realm is what is really out there, but not knowable in any empirical way. We only have an inner sense that something is out there to make sense of our sensations of it. I have a big long quote here from Van Til, but the important part of that quote is down at the italicized section, where it says, where he reviews Kant and he's talking about these divisions, and he says that this is great for the modern theologian because now he can talk theology without getting involved in scientific issues. And from the Christian point of view, and this is a good point that Van Til is making of Kant, and he studied Kant very carefully. From the Christian point of view, we have here the deepest possible rejection of the triune God of Scripture as a self-sufficient subject in relation to whom all facts in any realm, lower or higher, have their meaning. In short, in Kant's position, we have a complete reversal of the covenant relationship in which man, the creature, stands to God. Now, man, instead of God, is now the one who ordains ordinances. And we could go down, there's another quote I have here in a few sentences, where he points out that God for Immanuel Kant is an ideal. It's just a limiting concept. Coming down further beyond that quote, we have, where it begins with the paragraph, this discussion. This discussion, like the one preceding, is not an academic parlor game. One logical result of Kant's influence on the practical level is that the ideal of God from the noumenal realm can only give us, watch the language here, can only give us a certainty of faith, but not a certainty of knowledge. And this is precisely what's going on in many intellectual circles today. We have certainty, but it's a certainty of my faith as a subjective thing, rather than a confidence in my knowledge of these events. Another result is that figurative language becomes a means of giving an appearance of biblical faith while denying its claims in the phenomenal realm of history. So we come to the next section, salvaging God's holiness through figurative interpretation. I cite there another example of Gunkel, and my only point about his analysis of Psalm 74 in that quote is that here's an example where Gunkel isn't interested in the history behind Psalm 74. The emphasis is on the Hebrew religious imagination. See, he follows through with Kant's thing. It's what's going on in the Hebrew prophet's mind that we're studying. Not what he's talking about, but it's an autobiographical account, and we want to be sort of depth psychologists of these Hebrew writers. Writing about the same time as Gunkel, but considerably more conservative in his theology, was Milton Terry, who is known for his work on hermeneutics. He reacted to the excesses of biblical criticism of his day, which had centered on discovering biblical texts and how they had come into existence. And he has this quote. He says, "I have in some instances allowed the claims of a radical criticism, which I am personally far from accepting, for the very purpose of showing," now look at this sentence, "for the very purpose of showing that the great religious lessons of the Scripture in question are not affected by critical opinions of possible sources, date, authorship, and redaction." And in discussing the creation narrative, Terry reveals rejection of more than just source criticism. He follows in the liberal tradition of rejecting biblical cosmology in toto. He writes, quote, "The discoveries of science have effectively exploded the old notion of the creation of earth and heavens in 6 ordinary days. We do not believe that Genesis was given to instruct men in astronomy or geology or chemistry." Thus he denies the historical factuality of the events in Genesis 1 to 11, in contrast to New Testament authors who repeatedly refer to these stories as historical revelation of the nature of man's sin and the other great religious lessons. More directly illustrative for our present purpose is how Terry treats the Exodus narrative of the plagues, whose imagery is largely appropriated in the New Testament apocalypse of John to portray the terrors and great signs from heaven, which there figure as trumpets of woe and bowls of wrath. He discards all discussion of their historicity, preferring to treat such reports of judgment as the mere drapery of human conceptions of judgment. Old Testament classical prophets' pronouncements of cosmic judgment upon Gentile nations so far transcended the immediate occasion as to throw the latter comparatively out of sight. Not unexpectedly, Terry treats the cosmic catastrophes of the sixth seal in Revelation 6 as the same manner in which he treated Old Testament judgments with similar imagery. Namely, the judgment is limited to the socio-political sphere, exclusive of any cosmic component. The ensuing judgment imagery comes mostly for the Exodus event. The final vision in Revelation, the catastrophic creation of the new universe, Terry writes, should not be interpreted as a literal record of historical events. The vision elements are to be recognized as symbolic pictures designed to indicate the ultimate victory of Christ and so forth. So we have a section summary now on this. We've moved from the cosmology. We've talked a little bit about this Kantian epistemology where everything is just a man projecting it out from his mind. So now what do? We skip now a few paragraphs. What went unnoticed was that Kant had replaced God with man. In his view, man's thoughts, including the biblical writer's religious ideas, arise solely from within. Whatever religious lessons that are derived from the biblical stories in the Kantian perspective must be anthropocentrically derived. Such lessons would then be nothing more than Hebrew autobiography. And of course, the consistent liberals went on to separate the ideal of Christ from the historical Jesus. Just an application of the same thing. So we go on now to the next major section in the paper, where evangelicalism's use of recent language theory to figurative interpretation of these kind of texts. We've had to deal with the cosmology, we've had to deal with the epistemology, because it's my understanding that the modern language theories that are coming into play in the area of hermeneutics are rooted on these two bases. And here I think we're going to get a little surprise from the text. Evangelicals have historically defended the authenticity of the biblical text in face of liberal abandonment of it. We all agree to that. But then, coming down to the next paragraph, we have a book that was highly recommended to me to read, and it's been an object of discussion for several years now in evangelical circles. While reading the well-known and widely used text Plowshares and Pruning Hooks, Rethinking the Language of Biblical Prophecy and Apocalyptic, I couldn't help noticing the many statements about the limitations of language. Since theologians have shown a tendency to imbibe uncritically alien cosmologies and epistemologies over the past century or two, I wondered about the nature of the theories of language now being used in evangelical hermeneutics. My brief comments on contemporary language theory below will be followed by the effects such theory has on special revelation.